For many families, the grocery bill does not rise all at once. It rises one item at a time. A few more dollars for meat, a little more for milk, a higher price on eggs. And now, another pressure point is showing up in a section of the store many shoppers visit every week: the produce aisle. Fresh vegetables are becoming one of the more visible grocery cost pressures in the United States. This does not mean every vegetable is rising at the same pace. It does not mean produce is driving the entire grocery bill. And it does not mean there is a national shortage of vegetables. The verified story is more specific. Fresh vegetable prices are rising faster than the broader grocery average. Tomatoes have become one of the clearest pressure points. Farm-level vegetable prices have moved sharply higher. Imports and shipments are playing a major role. And because fresh produce is perishable, seasonal, and sensitive to weather and transportation, pressure upstream can eventually reach the grocery shelf. For households, that matters because produce is not a luxury category. It is part of everyday meals. Tomatoes for sandwiches, lettuce for salads, vegetables for dinner. Ingredients for sauces, side dishes, lunches, and meals cooked at home. When produce prices rise, families may have to adjust how they shop, how they plan meals, and how far a food budget can stretch. The latest data explains why this category deserves attention. The USDA's Economic Research Service reported that retail fresh vegetable prices rose 3.1% from March 2026 to April 2026. That followed a 0.9% increase from February to March. Over the year, the increase was much larger. Fresh vegetable prices were 11.5% higher in April 2026 than in April 2025. That is the consumer-facing fact. The grocery shelf is showing pressure. And compared with the broader grocery basket, produce is rising faster. The Bureau of Labor Statistics reported that the Food at Home Index rose 2.9% over the 12 months ending April 2026. Over the same period, the Fruits and Vegetables Index rose 6.1%. That comparison is important. It shows that produce was not simply moving with the rest of groceries. It was adding more pressure than the grocery average. For a household, that difference can appear in small but repeated ways. A family may still buy the same basic food items, but the receipt becomes harder to manage. One category rises faster than expected, another remains elevated, another declines only slightly. The monthly food budget becomes less predictable. Inside the produce aisle, tomatoes stand out. USDA reported that fresh tomato prices were 39.7% higher in April 2026 than in April 2025. That does not mean all vegetables followed the same pattern. USDA also reported that fresh potatoes were 3.0% lower year over year in April 2026. That distinction matters. The produce story is uneven. Some items rose sharply. Others did not. But tomatoes matter because they appear in many common foods. They are used in salads, sandwiches, sauces, tacos, burgers, pasta dishes, and restaurant meals. When tomato prices rise sharply, the effect can reach shoppers directly. It may also create cost pressure for food service businesses. The exact pass-through to restaurant menu prices requires separate data. But the input cost pressure is clear. Tomatoes became more expensive at retail, and the supply chain behind them showed signs of strain. To understand why, the story has to move behind the grocery shelf. Fresh produce is different from packaged food. It cannot sit in a warehouse for long periods. It depends on growing seasons, harvesting windows, weather, labor, refrigerated trucking, cross-border supply, wholesale markets, and retail promotion. A disruption in one part of that chain can move through the system quickly. USDA explains that producer prices are usually more volatile than retail prices. Retail prices tend to lag movements in producer prices because the grocery shelf sits further down the supply chain. That point is central to the current produce story. Upstream pressure has been much stronger than retail pressure. USDA reported that farm-level vegetable prices were 56.3% higher in April 2026 than in April 2025. From March to April alone, farm-level vegetable prices rose 5.7%. That does not mean grocery prices will rise by the same amount. Farm-level prices do not pass through one-for-one to the retail shelf. Retailers, wholesalers, contracts, promotions, transport costs, and timing all influence the final price. But farm-level pressure remains an important warning signal. It shows that cost pressure began upstream, before the customer saw the final price in the produce section. USDA forecasts that retail fresh vegetable prices will increase 7.8% in 2026, but the prediction interval is wide, from 3.9% to 11.9%. That range reflects the uncertainty in fresh produce markets. Weather can change supply, imports can rise or fall. Shipments can be delayed, retailers can adjust promotions. Producer prices can move sharply, then reverse. USDA also forecasts farm-level vegetable prices to rise 20.5% in 2026, with a much wider prediction interval from 3.6% to 42.7%. That points to continued volatility. The farm-level market is moving with far more uncertainty than the retail shelf. But because retail prices can lag producer prices, shoppers may still see some effects later, depending on how the supply chain adjusts. Imports are another major part of the story. USDA reported that imports accounted for 35% of U.S. fresh vegetable availability in 2025. That means more than one-third of fresh vegetable supply came from outside the United States. Mexico is especially important. USDA reported that Mexico supplied 77% of U.S. fresh vegetable imports from 2023 to 2025. Canada supplied 10%. Imports are not a problem by themselves. They are part of how U.S. grocery shelves remain stocked across seasons. They help provide fresh vegetables when domestic production is limited. But import dependence means U.S. shoppers are connected to weather, production, transportation, and policy changes far beyond the grocery store. If shipments slow, if weather disrupts a growing region, or if trade costs change, the effects can move through wholesalers and retailers. In 2025, USDA reported that fresh vegetable imports declined 3%, reaching 18.6 billion pounds. In January and February 2026, fresh vegetable imports were down 6.7% from a year earlier. That does not prove a broad shortage. It does show that supply inflows had weakened at a time when prices were already rising. For tomatoes, the import connection is even stronger. USDA reported that imports accounted for 68.9% of fresh tomato domestic availability in 2025. In 2024, that share was 71.7%. Mexico accounted for 90% of U.S. tomato imports from 2023 to 2025. That means the U.S. tomato market is heavily connected to Mexico. When tomato imports from Mexico change, the effect can be significant. USDA reported that tomato imports totaled 4.47 billion pounds in 2025, down 5% from 2024. Domestic tomato production rose 7% to 2.18 billion pounds, but that increase did not fully offset lower imports. Fresh domestic tomato availability fell to 6.49 billion pounds in 2025, down 1% from the 2024 peak of 6.56 billion pounds. For consumers, that means the supply picture was not expanding smoothly. Domestic production improved, but imports declined. The net result was slightly lower domestic availability. Then early 2026 added more pressure. USDA reported that total U.S. tomato import volumes were down 16% year-to-date through February 2026. Tomato imports from Mexico were down about 15% from August 2025 through February 2026 compared with the prior year. Shipment data also weakened. Using Agricultural Marketing Service data, USDA reported that total tomato movement declined about 17% from January through the third week of April 2026 compared with the previous year. Domestic tomato shipments declined 28%. Shipments from Mexico declined 14%. Those declines matter because movement is critical for a perishable product. Tomatoes have to be harvested, packed, shipped, stored briefly, delivered, displayed, and sold. If movement falls, wholesale and retail markets can feel pressure, depending on timing and location. Weather also played a role. USDA reported that below freezing temperatures in Florida during late January and early February 2026 likely disrupted tomato harvest and shipment patterns. Florida is an important winter tomato production state. A weather disruption during a key harvest window can reduce supply available to the market. USDA also identified adverse weather in key production regions in Mexico, particularly Sinaloa during the winter season, as a possible constraint on exportable tomato supplies. This is one reason the tomato story should not be reduced to one cause. There was also a trade policy change. The U.S. Department of Commerce terminated the 2019 Tomato Suspension Agreement and resumed anti-dumping duties on fresh tomato imports from Mexico. The duty was 17.09% on most fresh tomato imports from Mexico. Effective July 14, 2025, USDA said those duties were expected to place upward pressure on domestic tomato prices. But USDA also cautioned that the extent to which policy versus production conditions contributed to import and price shifts remains uncertain. That caution is important. It would be misleading to say the tomato price increase was caused only by the duty. It would also be incomplete to ignore the duty entirely. The verified evidence supports a more careful view. Tomato prices were rising sharply. Imports were down, shipments were down, weather affected production regions. A trade policy change increased costs on many tomato imports from Mexico. USDA said both policy and production conditions were consistent with the shifts in the market, but the exact contribution of each was uncertain. For a serious economic documentary, that uncertainty is part of the story. Food prices are often the result of overlapping pressures, not a single cause. The retail shelf is the final point in a long system. At the farm level, prices can move sharply. At the shipping level, volumes can change. At the border, imports can rise or fall. At the policy level, duties can affect costs. At the grocery level, retailers decide how much to pass through, how to price promotions, and how to manage perishable inventory. By the time the shopper sees the price, the chain is already several steps deep. The produce aisle also contains many different items. USDA noted that tomatoes and potatoes each represent about 13% of the fresh vegetable CPI index. Lettuce represents about 9%. Other fresh vegetables represent about 2/3 of the index. That means tomatoes are important, but they are not the entire fresh vegetable story. If tomatoes rise sharply, they can influence the category, but broader movement across many vegetables also matters. The script should not suggest that the entire produce aisle is driven by tomatoes. The more accurate conclusion is that tomatoes are the clearest visible pressure point inside a broader fresh vegetable increase. For households, the practical impact is straightforward. Fresh vegetables are part of normal grocery spending. When the category rises 11.5% year over year, and a common item like tomatoes rises 39.7%, families may adjust what they buy. They may switch products. They may buy fewer fresh items. They may look for sales. They may use more frozen or canned alternatives. They may change meal plans. Those household responses vary, and the current research does not quantify them. But the budget pressure is visible in the price data. Food is not an optional expense. A household can postpone some purchases. It can delay a vacation. It can reduce entertainment spending. But groceries remain a weekly cost. For middle-class families, rising grocery costs compete with rent or mortgage payments, utilities, insurance, transportation, medical bills, credit card payments, and savings. Produce may be only one part of the food budget. But when it rises faster than the broader grocery average, it becomes another pressure point inside the monthly budget. The impact can also reach food service. Restaurants and food service operators use tomatoes, lettuce, peppers, onions, and other produce as ingredients. Higher produce costs can pressure margins or menu prices. The exact pass-through to restaurant prices requires more specific data, so it should not be overstated. But the mechanism is clear. When input costs rise, businesses that use those inputs face pressure. Retailers and wholesalers are affected as well. Fresh produce is perishable. Unsold products can spoil. Retailers have to manage price, inventory, quality, and promotion timing. Wholesalers have to manage shipment changes and shifting supply from domestic and imported sources. For growers, the story is also complicated. Higher farm-level prices may sound positive for producers. But growers also face production risks, weather, labor, input costs, and market volatility. The current research does not include enough verified grower margin data to claim that growers are broadly benefiting. That is another important caution. A higher price in one part of the chain does not automatically mean every participant is better off. In food supply chains, pressure can be spread unevenly. Some growers may benefit from higher prices if they have product to sell. Others may face weather damage or lower shipments. Retailers may absorb some costs or pass them through. Consumers may face higher shelf prices. The impact depends on timing, product, region, and market conditions. The current status is clear enough to support a focused documentary topic. Fresh vegetables were rising faster than the overall grocery basket as of April 2026. Tomatoes were the most visible pressure point. Farm-level vegetable prices were much higher than a year earlier. Imports and shipments showed signs of weakness. Mexico remained a major source of U.S. fresh vegetables and tomatoes. Florida weather disruption and Mexican production conditions played a role. The tomato duty added another cost pressure, but its exact role is uncertain. The story is not that America is out of vegetables. The verified data does not show that. The story is not that every produce item is rising equally. Potatoes were lower year over year. The story is not that one policy decision explains everything. USDA specifically says the balance between policy and production conditions remains uncertain. The story is that the produce aisle has become a visible place where supply chain pressure meets the household budget. That is why this topic fits the broader cost of living picture. For years, households have watched prices rise in different parts of their lives: gas, rent, insurance, electricity, debt payments, groceries. Now, inside the grocery basket, produce has become one of the categories moving faster than the average. And because produce is perishable, import-dependent, weather-sensitive, and tied to cross-border supply chains, it can change quickly. The next data points will matter. The May 2026 CPI release will show whether fruits and vegetables continued to add pressure. USDA food price outlook updates will show whether the fresh vegetable forecast changes. USDA shipment data will show whether tomato movement recovers. Import data will show whether shipments from Mexico stabilize. Weather in Florida and Mexico will remain important for key production windows. For shoppers, the issue is simpler. They do not need to follow every USDA table or every border shipment. They see the result in the produce section. A higher price on tomatoes, a more expensive salad, a grocery receipt that is harder to keep under control. That is how a farm-level price movement becomes a household cost. It begins with weather, imports, shipments, policy, and producer prices. It moves through wholesalers, refrigerated logistics, and retailers. It ends with the family deciding what goes into the cart. The current evidence does not support panic. It supports attention. Fresh vegetables are a real grocery pressure point. Tomatoes are the clearest visible example. And while the causes are mixed and the outlook remains uncertain, the household consequence is already measurable. The produce aisle is no longer just a quiet corner of the grocery store. It is becoming one more place where hidden pressure in the food supply chain reaches the American family budget.